Some men disappear in war. Others vanish afterward, not in body, but in spirit. Samuel Hayes was one of the latter. Once, he wore the uniform of a Marine like it was part of his skin, not for glory, not for praise, but because he believed in duty. In honor, in something bigger than himself. But now, at 67, he moved like a shadow through the broken bones of Fair Haven, Ohio, a town as weary as the man who haunted its alleys. Each morning, he dragged himself from a bench, a doorway, a forgotten corner. A duffel bag slung over one shoulder, faded, torn, its straps giving up, as if it too had seen battle. That bag carried everything he owned. But more than that, it carried a story most people chose not to hear. His story ended the day Caroline died. She had been his reason to come home, his tether to sanity. And when cancer stole her, aided by a long, cruel chain of misdiagnoses at a system meant to protect those like him, Samuel stopped existing in the way the world recognized. He sold their modest brick house, gave every last cent to the animal shelter she had loved, then vanished. He didn't die. Not in the way that's easy to write on paper. He became invisible. You might have seen him, hunched near the church steps, waiting for a sliver of warmth or a cup of coffee from a kind hand. Once, a volunteer sat beside him and asked, "What happened to you, sir?" Samuel had looked out at the falling snow and said quietly, "Some battles end with medals, others end with silence." He never begged, he never asked for pity. He survived by scavenging cans and sleeping where no one would tell him to move. At Marcy's diner, the waitresses would sometimes slip him an old sandwich, a cup of lukewarm coffee. No questions, no looks, just quiet dignity, the kind that means everything to a man with nothing left. But most others crossed the street when they saw him, as if poverty were contagious, as if sorrow could stain. That December was brutal. The wind in Fair Haven had teeth. It bit through coats and clawed under skin. Samuel's own jacket, once Marine issue, now hung off him like paper. His boots, cracked and leaking, squelched with snowmelt. His hands shook from hunger. 3 days, 3 full days without a real meal. That's how long it had been before he gave in. That afternoon, dizzy and stumbling, Samuel pushed open the door of Paxton's grocery. The bell overhead jingled weakly, echoing across the aisles. The store smelled of bleach, bruised fruit, and dust, but to Samuel, it smelled like salvation. He hovered near a bin labeled 50% off, a pile of apples past their prime and bread that felt like stone. His stomach twisted. The kind of hunger that isn't just physical, it's survival screaming inside you. No one was looking. The stock boy was shelving cans in another aisle. Mr. Paxton, the owner, was helping a customer at checkout. Samuel hesitated. His fingers trembled violently. He reached into the crate and slid a bruised apple into his coat. Then a roll. It wasn't theft, he told himself. It was survival. He tried to walk out, head down, hands shaking. "Just keep walking." "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" The word snapped through the air like a whip. Samuel froze. Paxton was marching toward him, face flushed with rage, stabbing numbers into his phone. "Police, right now. We don't tolerate thieves." Samuel didn't resist. He just stood there, hollow. He had stolen 2 things worth less than $1, but what they took from him in return would be far more. Within minutes, the flashing lights lit up the store. 2 officers entered, one loud, one quiet. Derek Collins barked into his radio. Maria Lopez, eyes sharp, paused as she noticed the glint of metal beneath Samuel's coat. "Dog tags," she leaned in, her voice low. "You served." Samuel nodded faintly. Long ago, when that meant something. But rules were rules. And so, in front of shoppers who turned away and others who pretended not to notice, Samuel Hayes, once a decorated Marine, was handcuffed. Not violently, not cruelly, but indifferently, which in many ways was worse. Outside, no one asked what brought him there. No one cared to know who he used to be. That night, in a holding cell that stank of bleach and rust, Samuel drew out the only thing he had left, a worn photograph, edges curled, colors faded. Caroline smiled up at him. Young, eternal, beautiful. He whispered into the dark, "I'm trying, love, I'm still trying." Outside the cell window, the wind howled. And somewhere, quietly, fate began to turn its head. The morning after his arrest, Fair Haven's courthouse flickered to life like a tired machine. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, tiles chipped from decades of footsteps, and a line of defendants with eyes hollow from sleepless nights and deeper battles. Samuel Hayes shuffled among them. His boots scraped the floor softly, not because he wanted to be quiet, but because his body could no longer carry him with strength. The same jacket he'd worn for years, now stiff from melted snow, hung from his frame like old skin. His wrists ached faintly from the cuffs, not because they were too tight, but because his bones had grown brittle from age, from weather, from time. No one sat waiting for him in the pews. No one leaned forward in support. No family. No friends, no flags, just silence. Samuel was seated at the defendant's table. His old duffel bag, torn and half-collapsed, rested at his feet like a soldier standing guard. It had been with him longer than most people had. Across the room, the young court clerk recited names like she was reading inventory. Case 19842, the state versus Samuel Hayes. Samuel stood slowly, his knees protested, his spine wavered. A few heads turned in mild curiosity, but then quickly looked away, some with pity, others with the kind of polite revulsion people reserved for the homeless. The prosecutor, Alan Pierce, was sharp in a crisp suit, his tie perfect, hair combed like a fresh resume. He looked like he hadn't faced a real challenge yet in his career, and Samuel was just another folder in the pile to process. "Your Honor," Pierce began briskly, "the defendant was apprehended stealing food from Paxton's grocery. Security footage confirms the act. He has no address, no job, and a record of minor infractions. The state recommends he be held until trial to avoid further incidents." Routine, cold, precise. On the bench sat Judge Thomas Whitaker, silver-haired, glasses perched low on his nose, moving through cases like a machine. He barely glanced at Samuel as he turned over the file, flipping page after page with weary indifference, until something slid loose from between the papers. A soft metallic clink echoed through the courtroom. It was small, faint, but Whitaker paused. There on the bench, a scratched, worn dog tag glinted under the fluorescent lights. It had been tucked inside the file, attached to a thin chain. Whitaker picked it up, his eyes narrowed. Hayes, Samuel J. Usmk. Blood type O+. He looked again, this time truly looked, not at a homeless man, not at a criminal, but at a name. And something in that name cracked open a door long closed. Fallujah, 2004. The second battle, gunfire, screams, smoke thick with diesel and blood, the moment his Humvee exploded into fire. The man who pulled him out while bullets tore through the air hadn't spoken, hadn't hesitated, he had just acted. Whitaker's chest tightened, his hands trembled ever so slightly. He cleared his throat. "Court will take a 5-minute recess." The clerk blinked, "Sir." "Now." The gavel fell sharp, loud, final. Pierce looked confused, trying to object, but Whitaker ignored him. "Counsel, approach." Then he rose and disappeared into his chambers, the door shutting behind him like a vault sealing away a secret. Samuel remained standing. Dazed, he wasn't sure what had just happened. For the first time in years, something in the system paused for him. No one had ever stopped for him, not since Caroline, not since the wars, not since the country forgot his name. He sat slowly, afraid to hope. Behind the thick doors of his chamber, Judge Whitaker stared at the dog tag in his palm. The name, the steel, the years he had buried under rulings and routine, Samuel Hayes. He closed his eyes and the war came rushing back. The fire, the chaos, and a man who had lifted him, bleeding, unconscious, out of certain death. He sat down, hard, his body shaking under the weight of memory. He flipped open the file again. Read what had become of that hero, discharged honorably. 3 combat tour, Bronze Star recipient, VA benefits terminated, no known address, case closed, as if a life could be erased because it had no mailing label. Whitaker pressed his hand to his forehead. "God forgive us," he whispered, and in that moment he saw what the court never did. That the crime committed was Samuel's, it was theirs. The courtroom was unusually quiet. People whispered, shifted, wondered. Why had the judge stopped the proceedings? Why did he vanish mid-motion, leaving behind a gavel echoing like thunder? No one knew. But Samuel, still seated at the defendant's table, felt something shift in the air. Not a breeze. Not warmth, something deeper. He didn't dare speak, didn't dare dream. He had been invisible for so long, he almost believed he was meant to remain that way. Minutes passed like hours. Then the heavy doors at the front of the courtroom creaked open. Judge Whitaker returned. But he was not the same man who had left. Gone was the mechanical judge who flipped through lives like they were files. In his place stood someone slower, more deliberate. His expression was hard to describe, not angry, not emotional, but anchored. Like someone who had remembered something too important to forget again. He sat, adjusted his glasses, then looked directly at Samuel, no longer avoiding eye contact. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice low, firm, steady, "before this court proceeds any further, I am ordering an immediate and full review of your military service records and VA benefits status." The courtroom buzzed. Small gasps rose from the gallery. The young prosecutor, Alan Pierce, opened his mouth to protest, but the judge held up a hand, fingers still trembling slightly, and silence returned. "Furthermore," Whitaker continued, "this court formally requests that the Veterans Legal Defense Network provide Mr. Hayes with pro bono legal representation, effective immediately." Samuel didn't understand, not fully. His mind, used to doors slamming shut, couldn't grasp one finally opening. Judge Whitaker leaned forward, his voice softer now. "You are not invisible here, Staff Sergeant." The title hit the air like a hymn, and for a moment Samuel bowed his head, not out of shame, but to hide the sudden sting of tears. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, slow, silent, and pure. But inside this room, something colder had just cracked. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the faint whisper of something he had abandoned: recognition, humanity, and maybe hope. That night, back in the quiet of his jail cell, Samuel sat with his back pressed against the wall. The air smelled of rust and damp cement. He hadn't eaten the tray they gave him: watery stew and a hardened roll. Hunger had been replaced by something far stranger: numbness. He pulled from his shirt the photograph of Caroline. Even faded and worn, her smile was still radiant, still alive. He held it close as if it could protect him, as if it could still speak. And in his mind, he heard her voice, soft, patient, strong. "If you're lost, Samuel, it's not forever. I'll wait for you." He whispered into the silence, "I'm holding on, love. I'm still holding on." In the cell next to him, a young inmate, loud and bitter, scoffed as he walked past. "Old guy like you, still clinging to war stories. PTSD, right? Sure, made it all up, didn't you?" Samuel didn't respond. He had fought battles that boy couldn't imagine. Battles that didn't leave medals, only silence. When the kid shoved him hard in passing, Samuel staggered, caught the edge of the metal bunk, and righted himself. Still, he said nothing. No retaliation. Just calm, the kind of calm that only comes from surviving far worse. He returned to the bunk, held the photo again, and whispered one more time, "Just holding on." While the jail slept in concrete silence, across town, the courthouse was still lit. In his chambers, Judge Thomas Whitaker sat hunched over a pile of papers that had suddenly become more than documents. They were pages of a life, a soldier's life, one that had slipped, been shoved through the cracks. A pot of stale coffee sat untouched on his desk, growing cold like everything else in the room. He wasn't interested in caffeine, he was chasing truth. He had pulled Samuel Hayes' full military file. It was thick, worn, annotated in places with typewritten comments, black ink stamps, and dates that told their own story. Page after page, Whitaker read. Bronze Star for Valor, 2003. Shielded wounded Marines during a mortar attack in Mosul. Purple Heart twice, one for injuries sustained pulling civilians from a burning vehicle, another during a street ambush. Combat Action Ribbon, Overseas Service Medal. Good Conduct, letters of recommendation. But buried between the medals and citations were the pieces that hurt the most. Notes from field officers describing not just a brave Marine, but a man who mentored, who read to younger soldiers, who shared his rations with strangers, who carried children from collapsed buildings in Fallujah. This wasn't just a soldier. This was a guardian in war. And then came the timeline that brought Whitaker to his knees, discharged honorably in 2005, returned home, VA enrollment started. Then the notes turned colder. Missed appointment, mail returned no address, contact attempt failed, termination of benefits due to inability to verify residence, case closed, not for misconduct, not for fraud, but because Samuel Hayes, a man who had risked everything, didn't have a mailbox. Whitaker dropped the file, leaned back, covered his face with both hands. How many more like him? How many heroes had been filed away under silence? He whispered to the empty room. "We didn't forget him, we erased him. When Samuel had returned from war, Caroline had been waiting. But PTSD, untreated and denied, began unraveling the small life they had tried to build. He couldn't navigate the bureaucracy, couldn't chase missing documents while watching his wife fade. And when Caroline died, the final thread snapped. By 2007, no address meant no help. No help meant no survival. The system hadn't failed Samuel by accident. It had failed him by design. The next morning, snow dusted the roads in quiet layers as Samuel was escorted once more into the transport van. He didn't ask where he was going, didn't expect anything different. More courtrooms, more disappointment, more polite procedures disguising quiet abandonment. When they arrived, the bailiff opened the van door and gave him a strange look, not pity, something closer to respect. As they walked toward courtroom 3, the bailiff whispered, "Straight inside, Sergeant." The word hit Samuel like thunder. Not Mr. Hayes, Sergeant. He stopped walking, just for a second. It was the first time someone had called him that in nearly 20 years. He stepped into the courtroom and froze. The benches weren't empty today. Standing at the back were 3 Marine officers in full dress blues, polished shoes, medals shining, uniforms crisp like ceremony. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stood, silent, watchful. Behind them, the gallery was full. Some wore veteran caps. Others held folded American flags to their hearts, a sea of strangers who had come not to accuse, but to witness. And at the defense table sat a sharply dressed woman, her hair tied back, a leather briefcase beside her. She stood. "Staff Sergeant Hayes," she said calmly. "My name is Rebecca Monroe. I'm with the Veterans Legal Defense Network. I'm here to represent you." Samuel blinked. I don't have money for a lawyer." She gave a soft, fierce smile. "You don't need money, you have the truth." From the bench, Judge Whittaker adjusted his glasses. His face was firm, his voice unwavering. "This court has been made aware of extraordinary circumstances," he said, "and today we will hear testimony that demands our attention." For a moment the room stood still. No one moved. No one shuffled papers or coughed politely. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. At the front of the courtroom, Judge Whittaker gave a small nod. "Colonel Dunham, you may proceed." The man who rose was tall, composed, and dressed in immaculate military blues. The ribbons on his chest shimmered faintly beneath the overhead lights. His eyes, steady and unwavering, met Samuel's for a moment before turning to the judge. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but clear, "I served alongside Staff Sergeant Hayes in multiple combat zones. I witnessed, firsthand, acts of bravery, leadership, and humanity that went far beyond duty." As he spoke, the courtroom felt less like a place of judgment and more like a memorial, a sacred space where truth finally found voice. Dunham listed mission after mission. Hayes shielded wounded Marines during mortar fire, pulled civilians from burning trucks, shared his rations, taught literacy to younger recruits between patrols. He was the backbone of every platoon he touched. He paused, his voice tightened. He didn't just fight wars, he saved lives. He held broken men together when the world fell apart. Then came the heart of it. When Sergeant Hayes returned home, he was failed by the very system he served. His VA benefits were terminated, not for any fault of his own, but because he no longer had an address, a technicality, and in that silence he lost everything: housing, health care, mental support. The injustice done to this man is not a clerical error. It is a moral failure, one we all must answer for. The words rang through the room like a bell tolling at a funeral. The prosecutor, once composed and certain, now looked as if he wanted to disappear behind his papers. He didn't even try to object. Judge Whittaker sat forward, his voice steadier than before, but a slight tremor gave him away. "This court recognizes Staff Sergeant Samuel Hayes not as a vagrant, nor a thief, but as a decorated veteran who was cast aside by a system meant to serve him." He turned to the prosecutor. "Do you have anything further?" The young man swallowed hard, shook his head. "The state moves to dismiss all charges, Your Honor, with prejudice." The gavel fell once, twice. The sound was final, not a judgment but a release. "Dismissed." Samuel didn't move. He couldn't, not because he didn't hear it, but because the weight of it was too much. His arms hung heavy. His chest felt full of everything he had carried alone for years. Then he noticed it. The gallery. They were rising, not clapping, not cheering, rising hand over heart, heads bowed, like soldiers honoring a fallen comrade. And the three Marines at the back, they raised their hands in salute. Not pity, respect. Samuel Hayes, forgotten, dismissed, cast out, stood, not hunched, not trembling, tall. He lifted his hand, slowly, deliberately, and returned the salute. The silence in the courtroom deepened, not with absence but with meaning. He was not alone anymore, not invisible, not abandoned. The bailiff approached, eyes softened, posture straight. "Sergeant Hayes," he said gently, "you're free to go, sir." The last word, sir, caught in Samuel's throat. It had been decades since anyone said it to him with sincerity. As he stepped down from the stand, the crowd parted, not like they were avoiding him, but like they were making room. Making room for a man who had carried a nation's promise and been forgotten by it. Near the exit, a ripple of movement, a commotion, then a voice. Soft, desperate, cracking, "Uncle Sam." Samuel turned. A young woman pushed through the crowd, tears in her eyes. Her hands shook as she reached for him. "It's me, Ellie, Caroline's niece." Samuel froze. The name Caroline struck like a thunderclap across memory. She threw her arms around him, sobbing. "I've been looking for you since Aunt Caroline passed. You just vanished." Samuel, trembling now for a different reason, pulled back to see her face, and there it was. Caroline's fire in those eyes. That same stubborn brightness. "I thought there was nothing left," he whispered. Ellie shook her head. "You're not alone anymore, not ever again." The cameras flashed. The journalists took notes, but no one interrupted, because even they understood. This was sacred ground. The next day, the town of Fairhaven was quieter than usual, but not out of routine silence. Out of reverence. What had happened in Courtroom 3 wasn't just a legal event. It was a reckoning. The story of Staff Sergeant Samuel Hayes, a war hero turned invisible, then redeemed, had begun to spread like fire in dry brush. Not as scandal, not as sensationalism, but as a wake-up call. Headlines poured out across news sites. Judge stops courtroom after recognizing veteran who saved his life. Homeless Marine hero finally sees justice. Forgotten warrior's name echoes through America's heart. And beneath those stories were photos. Samuel, standing at attention, saluting in court. Ellie, hugging him with tear-streaked cheeks. The Marine officers, hands over hearts. But behind the headlines, something real began to shift. True to his word, Judge Whittaker acted swiftly. He personally oversaw the process to reinstate Samuel's full veterans' benefits. Retroactive to the date, they were wrongfully terminated nearly 2 decades earlier. He partnered directly with the Veterans Legal Defense Network, who worked tirelessly to untangle years of bureaucratic knots that had quietly crushed Samuel's life. The Department of Veterans Affairs, now under intense public scrutiny, did something they had rarely done before. They issued a formal apology, not buried in paperwork, not wrapped in legal language. A real apology, signed, sealed, delivered in person. Samuel received a check for $278,000 in back pay. But more importantly, he received something no money could buy. A place to live, access to health care, and connection to a community of fellow veterans who welcomed him without judgment. He moved into a small, newly furnished apartment in a quiet neighborhood not far from the local VA center. It wasn't grand, but it was his. A caseworker helped him transition. A doctor began treating his long-ignored PTSD. And every Thursday, he joined a group of vets who played cards, drank strong coffee, and called each other by the ranks they'd earned. 1 month later, Fairhaven did something it had never done before. They held a public ceremony at City Hall, not just for Samuel, but for what he represented. They called it a celebration of honor, but the people knew it was something more. The town was decorated with banners. Children waved miniature flags, veterans dusted off their uniforms, local businesses donated food. And in the square, musicians played beneath a blue winter sky that felt almost spring-like. Samuel sat backstage in a freshly pressed coat. Not a uniform, he no longer needed one to prove who he was. But pinned to his lapel were his medals, cleaned and gleaming once more. When he stepped onto the platform, the crowd rose to their feet, not in a burst of applause, but in a rolling wave of recognition. It was the sound of a town making amends, of people remembering what it means to remember. Judge Whittaker stepped forward and handed him a plaque. The inscription was simple, but it burned into the soul. For service, for sacrifice, for unseen valor, Fairhaven remembers. Samuel held it with both hands, then stepped to the podium. He hadn't spoken to this many people in decades. He cleared his throat. "I didn't save lives for medals," he began, his voice rough but unwavering. "I didn't fight for thanks. I fought because a man doesn't leave others behind." He paused, letting the words breathe. "And when you come home," he continued, eyes scanning the crowd, "you hope maybe, just maybe, someone will come back for you too." A hush fell, and then a whisper, "And you did." It was like the town exhaled all at once, 1,000 hearts breaking and mending in the same breath. That night, as twilight painted the sky in lavender and gold, Samuel sat quietly in the park. The same park where, once, he had eaten scraps beneath a crooked tree. Now he sat on a bench beside Ellie, who rested her head lightly on his shoulder. At his feet, a service dog, Rocky, donated by a veterans foundation, snoozed peacefully. Children played nearby. Their laughter echoed in the air like bells. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out Caroline's photograph. He smiled. "Found my way back, love," he whispered, tracing her smile with his thumb. "Just like you said I would." Above him, the first evening star blinked to life. And for the first time in decades, Samuel Hayes felt not just safe, but seen. The world didn't change overnight. But for Samuel Hayes, it didn't need to. It had already changed enough. He now woke up in a bed that was his, not a bench, not a shelter floor. A bed with clean sheets, warm light, and a photo of Caroline beside the lamp. His mornings no longer began with hunger. They began with purpose. Rocky, his service dog, would greet him at the door, tail wagging softly. They'd walk down to the cafe on 5th, where the waitress knew his name and asked about his day, not his past. The people he passed on the sidewalk didn't avert their eyes anymore. Some nodded, some smiled, some said thank you. Samuel never got used to that last part, but he learned to accept it quietly, gratefully. Every Thursday afternoon, he joined a group of fellow veterans at the rec center. They played poker, shared old stories, and sometimes, when the room got quiet, they didn't need to say anything at all. There was a kind of brotherhood in silence, a language spoken by those who had survived the same storms. He had his benefits back, his health care, his community, but most of all, he had something that had once seemed impossible: peace. One evening, after a local news station aired a short segment on his story, letters began arriving. Dozens at first, then hundreds. They came from across the country, strangers who had read about him, heard about him, or saw themselves in him. A boy from Iowa wrote, "My dad served too. He disappeared after. I hope he finds a way back like you did." A woman from Virginia sent a drawing of Samuel with Rocky, captioned, "To the soldier who didn't give up." And from an old Marine in California, "You carried more than your pack, brother. You carried the weight of all of us who were left behind. Semper Fi." Samuel kept the letters in a shoebox. He didn't read them all at once. He read them slowly, one at a time, like taking sips of something warm after years in the cold. As winter softened into spring, a ceremony was held at the National Veterans Memorial. Not a parade, not a spectacle, just a gathering. Dozens of men and women, in uniforms old and new, stood together as Samuel was presented with a commemorative plaque by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. The speech was short, but the words were carved in memory. Let this be a reminder that a veteran's worth is not measured by paperwork or pay grade, but by sacrifice, by silence endured, by the courage to keep walking when no one sees you. That night, Samuel sat on his small porch. Ellie was inside making tea. Rocky rested beside him, twitching in a dream. The town was quiet. Lights blinked in windows. The flag atop City Hall fluttered gently in the wind. He looked up. The sky was wide and clear, and overhead, stars shimmered in a hush that no longer felt lonely. He pulled out the photograph of Caroline, still folded, still creased, still holding her smile like a secret only he understood. "You waited for me," he whispered. "I found my way home." And in that moment, not loud, not triumphant, but calm, steady, and whole, Samuel Hayes was no longer forgot. He was known, he was honored, and he was finally home.